Good afternoon. So, I'm a poet sometimes. Sometimes I'm a dad, sometimes I'm just noisy. And today I'm going to be a combination of whatever people want to call me. I'm going to be talking about learning. Language learning. The thing I put there is the letter I to begin with. Essentially, I'm going to be talking about expectation and what our acquisition of language has to do with the kinds of expectations we should have of people when we're teaching them, and also expectations we should have of ourselves when we're learning something. I grew up in Ghana, and I find one of the big differences between the learning I did in Ghana and the teaching I did in Ghana, and the learning I do here and the teaching I do here is expectation. In Ghana, there are huge expectations of people to perform, and they do. And over here, sometimes I find the expectations are less. But I think that one of the most complex things that we ever learn in life is a language. And we come to language with no tools, with no background, no foundation. And yet we all manage to get to the point where it doesn't matter I grew up in a small town in Accra, I'm speaking to you in your language, which is not even my first language. And I think that's fantastic. And just having one language is actually one of the most complex things that we can do. And if we can accept that language is one of the most complex things that we'll ever learn, why should anything else be complex? I'm going to try to extend this argument by using mathematical correlations. So the I over there, which stands for I can or I can't, expectation, is also what in mathematics is called the imaginary number. Now the imaginary number is a concept that scientists came up with to represent the square root of -1. Because actually in science, if you square anything, if you square a negative, it becomes positive. If you square a positive, it becomes positive. But in order to explore certain ideas, there had to be the notion of something that could be squared to give you a negative, so they created the imaginary number. Now what's its correlation in language? Emotion. That which doesn't appear real, but is very essential and very strong in conveying what's real. The first thing a baby learns is emotion. And that's actually how they begin to pick up the cues to understand language and to communicate with us. So by equating emotion with this imaginary number, which is some high-level mathematical concept, you realize we have this high-level intelligence even before we ever step into a school. So now, as I said, it's the square root of -1. The interesting thing about I is that when you square it, you get -1. If you square it again, if you square -1, you get a positive. So if it's raised to the power 4, you get a positive. And I find that actually in most people's lives, if you have 4 positive things, you're onto a winner. My 4 positive things were my parents, a couple of great teachers, food, and the ability to sleep under any circumstances. But most people have different, 4 things. But if you can think of 4 really positive things in your life, you're probably in an okay place. So, as I said, I relate that to emotion, and I'm going to go to mathematical equation. So this, for those of you who know mathematics, is a simple polynomial expression. To solve this, you would subtract, I guess, and you would get 4k is equal to 8, and therefore k is equal to 2. Okay, so you solve the equation. But that also correlates to something that babies do. So you say to babies, I love your nose, oh, I love your eyes, I love your mouth, and you're pointing all the time. Now, they might pick up the nose, the mouth, the eyes because you're pointing, but they know the connotation of I love is good because of the way in which we say it. And therefore they start to use I love. They may not know the exact meaning, but that's how they start to decode. Okay? So it's the same process doing your X and Y's, or in this case, your J's in your case, because I'm being sequential, we start from I, so I'm going to J and K. Is one of the ways in which we're doing mathematics all the time, right from birth. And so if a child can do this, why can they not do a mathematical equation? And this actually is the foundation stone for quadratics, for differentiation and integration, up to what we call rocket science, which is our metaphor for the most complex things on Earth. Now, again, here's another mathematical thing. There are some people who recognize this straight away as something that relates to the difference of squares. Okay, so you see that and you kind of know that that translates into L plus 3, L minus 3. It's a pattern you recognize. Now, I'm sure some of you might have some of you have kids because that's why you're here. But those of you who are younger will have little siblings. And you find this thing where babies start to laugh at a joke when you know they don't know the meaning of the joke, but they laugh at exactly the right time. And they do it enough times so you know it's not just serendipity. It can't be that they laugh at exactly the right time. And what's happened effectively is they're detecting patterns. So they know the kind of tone of voice that you use for your jokes. I mean, all of us know, my dad used to tell the same jokes. 40% of the jokes were the same, and then you get some new ones. And so people have their ways in which they introduce jokes. So somebody will say, oh, you would never believe what happened to me today, So all of these patterns, the baby picks up, and then they can tell the tone, and then they laugh at exactly the right time. And now, while they may not understand what was being said, this is where the sense of comedic timing comes. So again, we're looking at something really complex that's being done every day by babies everywhere. Now, if you think that these are two very simple concepts, one of them is experiment elimination, and one of them is recognition of patterns, which is just chance. But actually, experimentation and chance are the foundation stones of all our knowledge. That is why in science you have the experiment and you have the control, because you have to be able to eliminate in order to get knowledge. And chance, serendipity, penicillin is the great serendipity story. So basically, everything we know is founded on these elements. And actually, when you think about walking down, we went to lunch. Did anyone bump into anyone? Like, really hard? No. So this is the interesting thing, right? So as you're walking out of this, because we look at the number of you, and we all walk through this narrow corridor, some of us standing side by side, and didn't bump into each other. So actually what you're doing is, someone's walking towards you, you're calculating the velocity of their motion, adjusting yourself so that you don't collide with them. So you're doing angles, you're doing velocity, you're doing all of these complex equations in your head without thinking about it. So for anyone to suggest, when you go to school, that I'm not good at mathematics, I would suggest that if you were not good at mathematics, you'd have fallen on your face a long time ago. So if we can expect people to do things, they tend to do them. And that's the fundamental argument I'm making. When I was in Ghana, I taught biology and physics in the north of Ghana after my A-levels. Now the interesting thing was, I hadn't studied biology. I was only a couple of pages ahead of my students every time. But the fact of the matter is, I expected to be able to understand what I was reading and to teach them. But I also realized that the language was a barrier for them. They were being taught in English, which they weren't very conversant with, and this was affecting their grades. And it relates to, I think, one of the stories about Soweto. People having to learn in a language that's not their language. So it's very easy for people to then say they're not very bright, but actually it's just the language. It's just the language. What I did with these students, I took them outside to their bikes to show them what centrifugal force looked like, centripetal force, and using I spoke a few words of the Bani, I didn't speak their language, and showing them, they actually knew more about biology than I did, because they were farming people. So it was just to have the language to say, this is what's, let me just move on to the next slide. So this is this is what's called a complex number, what we call the real number and the imaginary number. When you think about it, all numbers are abstract, so it doesn't really matter. But this is a kind of high concept, and I think all speech, this is what it comes down to. What we hear and the emotion, and the combination of those things, which is a high mathematical concept, is actually what we do every day. And so that's why people can say the same phrase, and it sounds fake, or it sounds real, or it makes you smile, or it doesn't make you smile. And so the underlying argument is that all knowledge is language. When you go to a doctor and you've broken your toe, and they say, it's a fracture of the anterior metatarsal, it doesn't really matter to you. You know that you're hurt. You know you're in pain. The doctor doesn't really know much more than you on an emotional or pain level. What they know is the language of bones. And that language of bones allows them to figure out how to help you. And actually, every single thing that we know in life is about language. It's about detail. So as you were talking about detail, I was switching on. Because detail is what it's about. And if we can make people understand that nothing should be too complex for them, and that we're just really trying to express a language, then it becomes much easier to expect more of people and to get people to achieve more. And this is the approach that I take when I'm teaching. But also, I take the approach that as a teacher, I'm also learning. And I think most teachers do this, but sometimes we have no time to do it because we just need to move on. But all knowledge is language is the approach that I think we need to use if we want to get better results in almost anything in life. So as the doctor speaks the language of bones, sometimes I might be teaching a poem. So, it might be, he wishes for the cloths of heaven. Had I the heavens embroidered cloths and wrought with golden and silver lights, the blue and the dim and the dark cloths, the night and the light and the half light, I would lay these cloths under your feet. But I, being poor, of only my dreams, I've laid my dreams under your feet. Tread softly because you tread on my dreams. And some student might say, what are you talking about? And I'll say, well, I need your keys. I will buy you diamonds. I will buy you pearls. Same thing is brought into the contemporary. Suddenly the student's interested. And what happens when you do these things is that the student then becomes engaged in the process of learning. They start to look for the parallels, and therefore you don't actually have to make them read anymore because they're going to go and look for those things. And that is the process that I try to champion in everything I do. So as much as I'm a poet most of the time, I also believe that the teaching of poetry and all other things, I'm a scientist actually by training. You probably have gathered from that. But I find that poetry and reading has actually taught me a lot about teaching, and a lot about learning, and a lot about my own self. When I went to university, one of the things that changed from when I was in secondary school and getting to university is I stopped going into exams worried about what I remembered. I just thought, I've read the material, I expect to do well. And two things happened. One, that I had confidence. The other is I was way less nervous, and I spent way less time not sleeping. Which goes back to my original point about my being able to sleep. Because sleep is so important when you're going to do exams. Anyway, coming back to this. So essentially I'm saying language is the key. The only barrier, the only boundary to learning is language. And as long as we understand that, and we understand also that there are levels of language. So, if you're talking to a group of people to whom this sounds odd, friends, Romans, countrymen, you can say to them, okay, you go to a concert, and the person comes and stands in front of you, and they say, all my ladies in the house, all my young ones, all the slightly gray-haired, all the ones with spectacles, what are they doing? They're engaging the audience. They're doing something that speechwriters, politicians all over the world have been doing for ages. They try and say something that makes the person who is over there feel that they are with them, so that they can communicate their message. It's the same thing that they're doing. So when the person says, are you in the house? Is London in the house? Is Chelsea in the house? Are you ready to party? It's exactly the same thing that was happening over there. And if you can get a student to understand that this fundamental thing happens around them all the time, that everything that they're going to learn is around them, and that it's relevant, and that it makes a difference if they'll just approach it differently, then all learning is without boundaries, because everything around us becomes part of our knowledge. Thank you.
In that break, you were chatting to each other. There was a bit of a conversation going on with me, and a little sense of disappointment. Despite how wonderfully stimulating and interesting and exciting his talk was, which indeed it was, all of those things, but some of you were saying, oh, it'd be nice to have had a poem. He's only going to do one now. Ladies and gentlemen.
Hi, I'm not Mike, and I've forgotten the title of the poem, but if you can get past that, we're good. So let's just call it music, because we just heard music. The basketball games I used to watch were taped from a scrambled channel, had no to speak of. I used to replay them in my head, lend my own fillet to the images, splice them into details. A hand like the arc of a mother's belly, awaiting the return of a ball sent down to concrete. A half-raised foot, pre-fake and swivel. A fall, fluid and dramatic, alive with the sweat of exertion. For me, the moves had no names, but there were patterns to their chaos. Determination flexed hard on 5 faces usually muscled, a win. Those games had an energy that hung over me, left clouds in my head that school could not disperse. Walking past the basketball for my piano lessons, I would stop, listen to the older boys belittling each other as they contorted their bodies into screens of guile. I only went 4 times before I missed my first lesson. Enough time for me to learn scales, how to hold my hand above the piano curve like a basketball, but not enough to play anything but do, re, mi, and the bass lines of hit songs I'd heard at the time. It seemed like music had lost the battle. I learned the language of the court, how to bow low to breeze beyond the barriers of the zone, crack my opponents by calling them names, advising them to go home, spend some time alone, learn the rudiments of the game, man. This became my music, the trash talk notated with polyrhythms of bounce, the oohs and ahs, the slick refrain of a swish, shut. I saw no connection between my new world and the one I'd left behind. The high post of the piano's back, the time tap of feet, the bounce of hammers responded to fingers and wires until 19 years later. Nat King Cole's on the TV staring hard at his audience, his hand setting up plays while he sings. Ray Charles said he sang so damn well, people forgot how good he was on keys. And I see it now. His right hand stuffs the melody down the grand piano's throat. That's the fake. He dribbles the sound down to low notes until you expect the left hand to come in lower. That's when he breaks the mold, hustles his left hand over the right, throws high notes into your ear. Crossover, up, swish. Now the trash talk. It's better to be by yourself, boy. He smiles, like the silent man on my tapes. And suddenly, every move has a name.